Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for joining us today from across the globe, from everywhere, wherever you are, morning and afternoon, evening, or even at night. Thank you and welcome once more. And on behalf of the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society, I warmly welcome you to the first seminar of our 2025 online series. It is our pleasure to introduce our speaker, Associate Professor Muhammad U. Faruque, who is currently the Associate Professor of Islamic Philosophy and Environmental Studies at the University of Cincinnati, USA. His works bring together religion, science, philosophy, and literature with a special focus on the Islamic intellectual tradition. Dr. Muhammad Faruque, he is the author of 3 books and over 50 academic articles, with his first book, Sculpting the Self, published back in 2021 with University of Michigan. The book has received the World Book of the Year award from the President of Iran. And he's also working actually a few projects, and one of his upcoming book is titled The Interconnected Universe, Sufism, Climate Change, and Ecological Living. I repeat again, The Interconnected Universe, Sufism, Climate Change, and Ecological Living. And the book, and I believe, proposed a compelling theory or compelling vision of the interconnected universe, arguing that Sufi contemplative practices offer pathways toward an ecologically grounded way of life. So we look forward to that book, Muhammad. And Muhammad's work has been supported by major institutions, including the Templeton Foundation and the U.S. Department of Education, and his writings have been translated also into several languages. And I just like to add, on a personal note, he enjoys gardening, spending time in nature, and also cooking, among other things that he enjoys doing. And he also has a deep passion for classical Indian music and Persian music too. Today, Muhammad will explore Ibn Arabi's vision of the interconnected and integrated self, and interestingly, he will bring it to how it is resonating in our present moment, our present contemporary life. And without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Dr. Muhammad U. Faruque to share with us his insights. The floor is yours, Muhammad.
Thank you, Chris, for the very kind introduction. And thanks to everyone for coming to attend this talk on a Saturday morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. So let me just say this. So I have some slides, which I'm going to be putting on very soon. But let me just say this at the very beginning. So this is not going to be a typical academic talk, because for me, the anthropocosmic self, which is the title of today's lecture, it's not simply a kind of abstract concept, but it's also deeply it's a part of my spiritual and personal journey. So I thought of starting. I thought of just sharing a bit about how I came to Sufism, Ibn Arabi, and also to this notion of the anthropocosmic self. And I'll also be talking a little bit before getting into the meat of the lecture, which is how Ibn Arabi himself explains this idea. I'll kind of explain the meaning crisis, individualism, happiness, and the modern self, because it's only against the backdrop of these ideas that Ibn Arabi's insight come alive and show their true significance. So, yeah, so I would say that I'm one of those people who are kind of born with what I call an existential impulse to ask, the metaphysical questions of who you are, who am I, and where have I come from, where am I going, what is my place in the larger scheme of things, those questions. But I was studying economics of all things as an undergrad at the University of London in London back in 2008, about, I don't know, 17, 18 years ago. And even though I was studying economics, I was deeply interested in philosophical questions and so exploring all of these ideas. And eventually, but I never heard of Ibn Arabi or even Sufism. I did have some vague ideas, but not really anything concrete. But anyway, eventually I was kind of asking these questions, and I actually I I was going through a sort of what I call jokingly quarter life crisis. And eventually I found a book by William Chittick, the famous scholar on Ibn Arabi called the Sufi, I think it's entitled The Sufi Path of Knowledge, Ibn Arabi's Metaphysics of Imagination. Anyway, that was kind of my first introduction to Sufism. And since then, I started reading about Sufism. And also, of course, I was pursuing my degree, but then I was really thinking about the big questions. And at one point, because economics, the way it's taught, especially in the UK, it's so deeply, science and mathematics, econometrics, those kind of quantitative methods focused, really does not give you any room to think about even larger questions in science. So, but for me, the metaphysical questions of what is real, what is good, and what is possible, those kinds of questions, like lie at the heart. It felt like they're kind of at the heart of every single kind of inquiry, in economic or otherwise. But the scientific method, because it's so deeply quantitative, would not allow me to kind of even think about these metaphysical assumptions that lie at the heart of any scientific inquiry or any kind of inquiry. Anyway, I did finish my degree, and I was actually doing good. Doing well. But after my degree, so it was during my third year, I decided to actually change my career from economics, from a career in finance to philosophy and Sufism. So I was really looking for qualified teachers who can really teach me about the metaphysics of Sufism and the kind of deep teachings of Sufism, not just superficial works or simply even translated works. So I decided to go to Iran because of all places in the Islamic world, this is one place where there is still 1,000-year-old tradition of Sufi metaphysics and philosophy, where there are really renowned teachers, very well-qualified teachers. So I was really asking a lot of people, and eventually ended up in Iran right after my degree, and everybody was surprised. My family, my friends, they just couldn't make sense of this transition from economics, world of finance, to Sufism and Islamic philosophy, and from London to Tehran. Usually it's the other way around. So people really, but I was going through this deep kind of internal crisis of meaning. So anyway, so I also reached out to people like William Chittick and others, and they all advised me to also learn Arabic and Persian well if I am serious about understanding the deep end of Sufi metaphysics, and especially the teachings of someone like Ibn Arabi, who is not kind of regular Sufi thinker. Anyway, so I did. I started learning Arabic and Persian, and eventually had a master's degree from University of Tehran, and also was studying with some of the topmost scholars of Sufism at the Iranian Institute of Philosophy. So that's the place where I was really deeply studying Ibn Arabi, but it was also tied to my personal journey and transformation. And after 6, 17, 18 years, I really feel kind of fortunate that I made decision when I was very young, because it's very difficult to make that kind of life-changing decision when you are over 30, and there are a lot of responsibilities. I'm sure we all understand family responsibilities, but when one is young, it's, I don't know, it's in a way difficult, but also easier. But the gist of this brief reflection on what I went through would be to say that this has been tremendously transformative. So when I ended up actually writing my dissertation in Persian and also Arabic on a very complicated topic, which in Persian called Barasiyat Tatbiqiyya Wujud La Bishad Maqsud Dar Metaphysics Laysa Yamullah Sadra. So it's the concept of the absolutely unconditioned being, wujud al-wujud Allah bishad maqsami in Arabic. It's even within in the annals of Ibn Arabi scholarship, this is a concept that is hardly discussed because it's very, very kind of technical. Anyway, I was studying ontology. I was studying even Sufism in general. But as I said, it was deeply transformative. So what I'll be talking about today, Ibn Arabi and the anthropocosmic self, is, as I was saying, is as much academic as it is personal. So I hope that will kind of help us to understand where I'm coming from and where I think is the significance of this particular topic lies in the context of our modern condition, especially the meaning crisis. All right, so the presentation itself, it's not going to be very long, maybe about 20, 25 minutes, because I already spent 5 to 7 minutes talking about this. So I have some slides, so let me so as I was saying, here is the kind of formal title of the talk, Ibn Arabi and the Anthropocosmic Self. And so it has 3 parts. First, I'll be talking about the meaning crisis, and then I'll be talking about Ibn Arabi and the anthropocosmic self, and the last part will be about its contemporary application or kind of contemporary reconstruction. So let's begin with this idea with the meaning crisis, with what some people call the meaning crisis that a lot of people in the West, or of course around the world, I guess, are facing. So what is the meaning crisis? So I don't know if anyone here is familiar with the lectures or work of John Vervaeke. He's one people among many others who talk about this. So the meaning crisis is the idea that we don't really understand what exactly we are living for, because modern life seems to be too focused on technology and computational skills, and forgetting of the deeper questions about how to live a good and wise life. So I think this is not very complicated to understand. Modern way of thinking, when it comes to the average perception, it valorizes work, career, and achievement above everything else. Life is seen as a kind of ladder as seen as a climb toward the top, and the achievement is the kind of essence of a good life. And successful people are to be admired more than quote unquote less successful people. And there's a kind of utilitarian logic behind this. Like, you work hard, you put more input, you get more output, and then you pursue your own self-interest. You think about your own success. You think about climbing the ladder and impressing the world. And that's how, meaning is kind of, even though people are not self-reflectively thinking about this, but this is, in the air, if you talk to people, they all would, if you ask them about life, what matters most in life, they would always talk about work, and also, of course, success and what they're doing and so forth. However, there comes a point when people retire, and then, or even during their career, they face a kind of midlife crisis, or even when they're young. It really, there's no kind of fixed, category about this. They face the question of meaning, and some people feel this very concretely about the loss of meaning and the purpose. As I said, it becomes very very clear when for some people when the career, once their especially successful career is over, but also a lot of people at some point or the other, they do wonder about where are they going with all of this. Is this all about work, success, and impressing the people, or there's more to life? So the drama of life, is this all about fame, success, love, depression, and loneliness, those things? So increasingly, it's not just, the positive talk about success and fame, but also increasingly about depression, loneliness, and a kind of crisis. So that's the meaning crisis in a nutshell. And I think many of you would agree with me that this is indeed the case with a lot of us. We're suffering from a kind of meaning crisis. We really don't understand what is it that we're living for. So, and in the midst of all of this, there's also a notion of the self, namely selfish or expressive individualism, a kind of version of individualism which is at work. So, when we're faced with a meaning crisis, the natural question to ask would be the question that I have here: what does it mean to be fully human in a world such as ours? So I believe that Ibn Arabi has some really important insights that can help us navigate our way. And so the reason why I kind of recounted a little bit of my own personal journey is to make that point. But again, it's one individual example is not suffice, and I also don't believe there are kind of ready answers that you can find in Ibn Arabi that will solve the meaning crisis. But if you accept that there is some kind of meaning crisis, and then I'm going to make the case that Ibn Arabi has some really important insights to kind of tell us about this, about how to navigate our way through this crisis. Let's now talk about the anthropocosmic self, but I also wanted to make another point about Ibn Arabi and the meaning crisis, because there are some scholars, philosophers like Charles Taylor, who kind of argue that, whatever you call as the meaning crisis or the identity crisis, this is all a kind of modern phenomena. In the pre-modern world, it was rather easier. People always had accepted notions of, meaning and God and transcendence and so forth. I actually disagree with that, because if you go through some Sufi authors, especially Ibn Arabi and Rumi, you do see that they were deeply thinking about the meaning of life. So I have this rather long quote from Ibn Arabi's Futuhat, and here, it gives you some kind of, I don't know, some kind of indication that Ibn Arabi was aware that human beings, because of their vulnerability, can often suffer from a kind of crisis of meaning. So let me just quickly read this passage, at least parts of it. So it says, quote, "Now this fundamental weakness of the human being was only so that his essence might always be accompanied by lowliness, neutralness, and the search for its survival and the need for its creator. Yet despite all of that, the human being still forgets his origin and becomes arrogantly proud of whatever power he may have accidentally acquired for a moment. Then he becomes so filled with pretension that he says, 'me,' and pictures himself boldly confronting immense terrors. Yet when a flea bites him, that essential anxiety is awakened by the existence of this pain. So he hastens to remove this pain, and he remains all upset until he finds that flea and kills it." So this is about the human vulnerability. The fact that on the one hand, modern life gives us all of this confidence to the technological advancement, but the kind of incredible things we're doing, let's say with AI or in other sectors. But at the same time, when it comes to our individuality, deep down, the anxiety, the vulnerability, although people do not say this, is as real now as it was for Ibn Arabi. So the meaning crisis was always present, although its manifestations, the way we are expressing it, is somewhat different. But that's not to say that, it never existed for other people. But anyway, I want to get to the more central topic. Don't want to spend too much time on the kind of background, but I guess it's only against the background of the meaning crisis and the kind of notion of the individualism, the selfhood that we have through individualism, and also questions of happiness and the modern self, that we can really come to appreciate this idea of what I call the anthropocosmic self. So what is the anthropocosmic self? So here's some basic remarks about the anthropocosmic self. So it begins with this central idea that cosmos, the universe, and the self or soul are not two separate realities, but two sides of the same coin, a coin that reflects divine unity. The anthropocosmic self reflects an organismic unity which pervades all forms of existence. It's the idea that everything is connected to everything else, as Al-Qunawi, Ibn Arabi's foremost student, said, "Kullu shay'in fi kulli shay." Everything is connected to everything else. So the reality of the self, unlike individualism of all varieties, whether it's Kant, Foucault, or Nietzsche, or Ubermensch, whatever, the reality of the self is no longer located in the conventional I. So that's the kind of basic idea. So I have here some nice painting from Paul Gauguin, the famous French post-impressionist painter. I'll come back to it, but I thought of putting this here because artists sometimes have insights that philosophers and scientists really lack. So in this famous painting of Gauguin, which is now I believe it's in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in the US. So this is a very kind of interesting painting where, sorry, this is kind of rather small, but in the upper left, yeah, there are three questions in French, three statements in French that he says in relation to this painting, asking, I think if I can read properly, it's, I think, d'où venons-nous, the first statement, where do we come from? And then, que sommes-nous, what are we? And then the last one is, où allons-nous? Sorry, my French is kind of limited to reading skills, so it's not very good. But in a say, where are we going? Those fundamental questions. So you can see right through our own time the fundamental questions that are deeply connected to the Sufi metaphysics, and people are still wondering. And in this painting, Gauguin, through all of these different metaphors represented, is wondering, like human beings go through all of these stages. We come to this world and as children, and then we pass through adulthood, and then we reach an old age. And then here you can see a white bird representing the fact that it's very difficult to talk about and explore and explain the meaning of life. Nonetheless, there is the idea of the beyond. So this idol in the background, blue idol, represents the idea of the beyond transcendence that is kind of in the background, even if we may not, we may be living in a world, we may be living in a world which is kind of materialistic at its essence. So the anthropocosmic self is asking us to kind of enlarge the notion of the self that we normally have of ourselves as individuals, as kind of isolated beings, as atomistic beings, kind of separated from other people and other human beings. So it's the very opposite of that kind of idea. You may be wondering at this point, so if you come from a more scholarly background, like how do Ibn Arabi talk about, what are some of the Arabic terms for selfhood, and what are some of the basic concepts regarding the very idea of the self before going to talk about the anthropocosmic self? So this is going to be very complicated. So I have to assume that, and perhaps not very necessary at this point. I don't want to spend 10, 15 minutes talking about the complicated terms that Sufi authors use to talk about the self, such as nafs, qalb, ruh, khafi, akhfa, and a host of other terms like latifa, rabbaniya, latifa. Like, they're just like in English, there are a lot of terms to talk about the self. There are also a lot of terms in Arabic and Persian, also in other languages, to talk about the self. And eventually, Sufi authors, including Ibn Arabi, as this diagram shows, from this, this is by Shah Waliullah, who is someone deeply influenced by Ibn Arabi in the 18th century India. So there are all of these very complicated models of the self that you can have from Sufi teachings. But at the very basic level, let's note that the key word for self is called nafs, Nafs, and it has a lot of different meanings, like behavioral inclinations, drives, instincts, impulses, irrationalities, human vulnerability, etc. It's also deeply connected to the idea of consciousness, self-consciousness, etc. So because they're trying to explain a cosmic understanding of the self, in a way, you can start from the individual, but it's always deeply connected to everything else in the universe. So this is a very complex diagram, actually showing that, reaching all the way to in the universal soul and the absolute selfhood of the divine or divinity, and in the middle you have the core of the human self-consciousness through self-presence. So I'm not going to explain everything about this, but eventually you do have a kind of very complex model of the self. And if this topic of further interest, you can explore my humble book on this, where I have a theory of the self, a kind of global framework to study selfhood in different cultures. Again, a very complex diagram having multidimensional aspects of the self here, like biophysiological, sociocultural, ethical, spiritual, but these are all pertinent when it comes to the general study of the self in Ibn Arabi or in Sufism. So I have some diagrams about these in my book, also in some of my articles, if you're interested. So here I want to come back to the idea of the anthropocosmic self and then talk about its contemporary application. So again, as we know, Ibn Arabi's teaching, his world, himself, he is described as an ocean without shore. So, I mean, it's so vast and complex, you can spend hours and hours just talking about the self, or just even talking about the anthropocosmic self, which can be traced to the notion of the perfect human, or al-Insan Kamil. But here I just thought of kind of providing some text and focusing on some key ideas so that we have a kind of, some understanding of like, what are the key tenets of this, the anthropocosmic self in Ibn Arabi. So one very crucial idea is about the anthropocosmic self is the notion of all-comprehensiveness. So this is a text from Ibn Arabi's Futuhat, and here Ibn Arabi says, for example, quote, "In reality, the human being is an all-comprehensive copy, Nusfa Jamia, in that there is within him something of the sky in one respect, and something of the earth in another respect, and something of everything in a certain respect. For the human being is, in reality, from among the totality of created beings. It's not said of him that he is the sky, or that he is the earth, or that he is the throne. Rather, so because he's explaining, because when it comes to the sky, for example, the earth, I mean, obviously, the sky is not literally part of human beings. I know we cannot really, I mean, the sky is much vaster than the human being. We cannot literally contain the sky within us. So he is kind of explaining that when he says we contain something of this sky, he's not talking about, he is not. So when he's talking about these different aspects of the universe, it does not mean that, you can, containing them kind of literally in a kind of physical, biochemical, or biogeochemical sense. Rather, the quote continues, it's not said of him that he is the sky or he is the earth. By the way, even though it's he, I mean, the idea of the anthropocosmic self applies to all genders, all male and female. It's not said of him that he's the sky and then he's the earth, and there are so many articles about, sorry, this is a footnote. There are many articles about this, especially Suad Hakim, and has written a couple of really nice articles about this, and you can find them on the Ibn Arabi website. Anyway, back to the quote. So it continues, it's not said of him that he is the sky or he is the earth or that he is the throne. Rather, it's said of him that he is like the sky in this respect and like the earth in that respect. Similarly, he is like the element of fire in this respect, like wind in that respect. So what is at issue here is the kind of the spiritual, what Sufis call the marna, like the kind of form of things, the essence of things. Like sometimes when we're angry, we express fiery nature. That does not mean, of course, we literally feel the pain. And if you want to explain it even scientifically, you can't simply explain through just chemical reactions. The feeling hot when one is angry, and for example, it's a real experience of feeling hot. It's not like the Galilean secondary qualities, which is simply in your mind. It's not in your mind when one is angry, especially very angry, and one is feeling the hot. But does this mean one literally becomes a fire? Of course not, but it feels like fiery. And sometimes there are some people whose nature tend to be more fiery, others kind of cold. So he's talking in that sense. So as you extend this analogy, the quote continues. So it is in this sense that he is a copy, nuskha, a very important term, and is called a human being just as the sky is called a human being, end of quote. So this is the idea that human beings, as I was saying, anthropocosmic self, everything is connected to everything else. The human beings is a kind of copy of the universe, whatever is found in the universe, and not just our universe, but also the worlds beyond. There's something of that in terms of its essence in the human spirit. And again, we live in a world where we tend to define human beings in the worst case scenario simply as a biological machine, simply as whatever going on, whatever chemical reactions going on in your brain. Obviously, if you're thinking of the human being only from a neurochemical perspective, this idea would not make sense. But then, the burden is on you to explain how is it that we're able to have consciousness, and how is it that consciousness is not physical. So, I mean, even though, from our whatever perspective, we have to admit of something essentially immaterial, something like consciousness when it comes to human being. And for the Sufis, that's none other than the spirit. But this spirit is not limited to just human beings. It's everywhere. It's ultimately a breath of the divine. So human beings, deep down their spirit at its core, has the potential to deeply realize this interconnectedness with everything else. So that's essentially the idea of the all-comprehensiveness. So there are many other facets of the anthropocosmic self that you can explain, but let's focus on another key dimension. The anthropocosmic self, when it's realized. So we also have to understand that when we're talking about the anthropocosmic self or selfhood in general, it's both a given and it's also a matter of achievement. So it's not like the anthropocosmic self, this idea of deep interconnectedness, it's already realized within every human being. It's not, but it exists as a potential. And depending on our choice, individual choices, we can actually come to realize the anthropocosmic self. But let's imagine it is possible to kind of concretely embody the anthropocosmic self. Then what are some of the signs? So here's what Ibn Arabi says again. Knowing the proper places of things. So that's one of the things, if the anthropocosmic self is realized, obviously through a lot of transformative spiritual practices and also a lot of contemplative effort, practice, devotion, then here are some of the potential results. So Ibn Arabi says, quote, they are the sages. You can also call them as hukama, sages, who put things in their proper places and judge things accordingly. They put the secondary causes in their correct locations while negating them in places from which they should be negated. In other words, you have a kind of intuitive sense of what's good for you, what is the right thing to do at this particular moment or also down the road, Of course, something in the context of meaning crisis is extremely difficult to figure out. But Ibn Arabi is saying that this is possible, or increasingly possible, to achieve a kind of equilibrium of things. So you put secondary causes in their locations, which is another way to explain that you don't negate the world of science. You don't negate scientific causes, or you don't negate science in general. That's part and parcel of our reality and important. But at the same time, that's not enough. You have to achieve practical wisdom and really understand have the intuition of putting things in the proper places, which is, of course, extremely difficult. But the deepest question is the question of, so who am I? And how does the anthropocosmic self sort of answers that? So here is a fascinating quote, which kind of summarizes, I would say, most of what Ibn Arabi says in a lot of his writings. So it's from Futuhat, chapter 367. He says, in this voyage, quote, in this journey, I attained the meanings of all the divine names. I found that they all go back to the one that is named and one essence, musamma wahid wa'in wahida. The named was I was witnessing, and that essence was my own wujud, being. Thus, my voyage was only in myself and pointed to none but me. End of quote. So ultimately, even though this is about the interconnectedness, but the very fact that human essence contains all other things in its essence, in the idea of the intelligible essence of everything else, when the anthropocosmic self is realized, one's selfhood is no longer confined to the kind of individual I. It's now deeply, it's no longer the I that we thought we were. It's rather, there's no kind of fixed point. It's undefined. It's everywhere and nowhere at the same time, bringing together God, human being, and the world. So that's a kind of the way I would say Ibn Arabi would explain the anthropocosmic self. I'll talk about, because I spoke about the meaning crisis, so it becomes natural to talk about the meaningful life. And also many people are wondering how some of these metaphysical ideas, especially if you dive deep into the text, it seems sort of, I don't know, how does it relate to my own specific, modern life? Maybe I think many people are wondering about that. Two more slides on a kind of modern contemporary reconstruction of the anthropocosmic self. So as I said, the anthropocosmic self, it's the word term itself, the anthropocosmos is a term that other thinkers have used in other contexts, like in Chinese philosophy, Du Weiming and prior used that term, and prior to that, Mircea Eliade, very famous scholar of religion and metaphysics, used the term, but not in the sense that I'm explaining here, and also not calling it as the in relation to selfhood. So the term is mine, but I think you can reconstruct from Ibn Arabi a notion that fits the way I'm explaining it here. So the anthropocosmic self also has a goal. It's the goal of the station of no station. So what is that? And this is something we are familiar, if you're familiar with Ibn Arabi, the maqam, la maqam, he calls it the highest station, the highest goal of human life. So by virtue of its deep interconnectedness with everything else, and by virtue of the fact that it reflects divine unity, it reflects all the divine names and attributes. And again, there's a kind of distinction between potentiality and actuality. Everybody contains the anthropocosmic self. Everybody contains the seed of this idea, but then not everybody comes to realize this. But when it does happen in different degrees, there is all-comprehensiveness, and then leading to the idea of no fixed definition. Because I used a boring analogy from another scholar, the idea of the mirror to explain this. So how does selfhood get redefined, as opposed to version of individual self, where Foucault might say something like constantly reinventing yourself is something that at best you can think about human flourishing as the goal of the self. But as opposed to that kind of individualistic notion of the self, the anthropocosmic self reflects all determinate things through indeterminacy, like a mirror, which is completely empty and completely full at the same time. So this is an extremely subtle idea. So then, as I was saying, there is no, at the end of the day, in the context of the anthropocosmic self, no fixed definition of the self. And actually having a fixed definition of yourself is the problem. And especially if you think about identities that people run into, or one of my colleagues used the term boxed in. We box ourselves into identities such as being a professor, being a doctor, being, I don't know, healthcare worker, being simply a worker, all of these different professions or other things that we do. And then, those identities have their social repercussions, and we get into trouble sometime. It can also relate to race, gender, and so forth. So the anthropocosmic self is telling us that while, like a mirror, those identities, those selves are part of who we are, and they do reflect our being, our selfhood, our identity in the mirror. But just like the mirror, even if it can reflect all of these different identities, it can also be, and showing that the mirror is full of all of these different identities, multiple identities that each and every human being has. But it can also be empty. And it is empty because the image that I have of myself in the mirror, let's say in my mental mirror, imagining myself only through a particular type, particular human type, psychologically or on a profession, whatever, is a kind of mentor mirror. I do appear to myself through that role, let's say being a researcher or Ibn Arabi and professor. But if I think that's the essence of myself, then I run into all the problems. I limit myself. I limit myself to all other myriad possibilities that are at the disposal. So that's where its significance come in. So naturally, I think we can talk about what I call cosmic consciousness in relation to this anthropocosmic self. It's like with the idea of the kind of, narrow idea of the individualism, thinking yourself kind of like an isolated island. This is like a concentric circle. You have your own self in the innermost circle, and then the circle gets expanded. And it includes your neighborhood, family, and then neighborhood, perhaps the next circle. And the next circle might be, I don't know, your nation, and the next circle again, maybe people are global citizen, whatever. And then the next circle might be beyond human beings, the non-human world, the modern human world, and beyond that, maybe the realm of transcendence. So it gets expanded and expanded, and it's a never-ending journey. That's why the station of no station. So these are some of the really profound ideas, and I think they have the potential to transform any of us, given that we are willing to embrace some of these ideas. And again, some of these teachings are not meant for everyone. We have to decide what works for us, what is meant for us. But these ideas can work, provided that we understand how to kind of apply them in real life. And obviously, when you're talking about cosmic consciousness, at that level, one has to transcend egoism, ethnocentrism, and chauvinistic nationalism, territorial nationalism, those kind of things. But there might be some critiques who might say, this is still talking about the human being, talking about the anthropos. It's kind of anthropocentrism, which is, which leads you back to kind of, I don't know, metaphysical individualism, perhaps. But Ibn Arabi has a response to that. So in Fusus al-Hikam, he says, quote, this is actually a poem. It's a rough translation. He says,